I used to believe that sacrifice was noble. 7 years in Iraq taught me that sacrifice defined who you were. I wasn't just fighting for my country. I was fighting for a future. For Sarah, my wife, the woman who promised to build a life with me while I was away. Every dusty sunrise in the desert, every sleepless night, every letter I wrote to her reinforced one simple truth. I was working for us, for our dreams, for a life that would finally feel complete when I returned home. But when I came home, I realized the life I had been fighting for didn't exist. Sarah had rewritten our story without me. The first clue was the house. I had imagined walking into a home full of warmth, with Sarah's arms wrapped around me before I even set my bag down. Instead, I stepped into a house that felt cold, impersonal. The furniture was different, sleek, modern, and nothing like the pieces we had picked out together before I left. There were framed pictures on the walls, but fewer of us than I remembered. One particularly prominent photo caught my attention. Sarah, standing in front of a new car, a car I didn't recognize. I wasn't angry, not yet. Deployment had taught me patience. I figured she'd just made a few changes while I was away, trying to keep herself busy. "Michael," she called out when she finally noticed me standing in the doorway. Her smile was bright, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She hugged me, but something about her embrace felt hesitant. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the shock of seeing me after so long. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everything would feel normal soon. But normal never came. That night, over dinner, the gaps in her stories began to appear. "I thought you were saving for the down payment on the house," I said when she casually mentioned the expensive renovations she'd done. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as a spur-of-the-moment decision. "And the car?" I pressed. I didn't approve any purchases from my account for that. "Oh, don't worry," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's handled." That was the first crack, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the air between us. Sarah wasn't just being evasive, she was hiding something. The second clue came a week later. I had just started unpacking when I found a stack of unopened letters buried in a drawer. They were addressed to me, letters I had written to Sarah during my deployments. She hadn't read them, not one. My words, my promises, my love, left to gather dust. That was when doubt began to fester. What else hadn't she told me? What else had she ignored? I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on getting settled back into civilian life. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But then came the third clue, the bank statement. It arrived in the mail one morning while Sarah was out. I had requested a full record of our finances to begin planning for the future. As I scanned the statement, my stomach twisted into knots. There were charges I didn't recognize, frequent withdrawals, luxury purchases, and hotel stays in my city while I was thousands of miles away. One particular name on the statements appeared over and over again. Tom. Tom's gym membership. Tom's tailoring. Dinner for two at an upscale restaurant. I didn't know a Tom, but Sarah clearly did. I confronted her that evening, my heart pounding as I laid the bank statement on the table. "Who's Tom?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. For a moment, she froze, her eyes darting to the paper like a deer caught in headlights. Then she laughed, a hollow, deflecting laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You're overthinking this, Michael," she said. "He's just a friend." "Just a friend?" I echoed. "Who you're buying dinners for? Paying gym memberships for? Using my salary for?" Her expression hardened. "It's not like that," she snapped. "You wouldn't understand." "Help me understand," I said, my patience thinning. "Where has all my money gone, Sarah? 7 years of my life, of deployments, of blood and sweat. What do I have to show for it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, leaving me sitting alone in a place that no longer felt like home. I stared at the bank statement, at the pile of unopened letters, at the empty chair across from me. The realization hit me like a bullet. Everything I had worked for was gone. Everything I had sacrificed for was a lie. The cracks widened quickly after that. Neighbors began whispering about the man they often saw coming and going from my house while I was overseas. "Oh, he's just a friend," they said, their smiles tight and awkward. We're sure Sarah missed you terribly. Friends who had once praised Sarah for her loyalty now avoided me, their pity disguised as politeness. And then there was Tom. The first time I saw him, he was lounging in my driveway, leaning against Sarah's new car as if he owned it. When I approached, he smirked and said, "You must be Michael. Sarah's told me so much about you." His voice was dripping with mockery, his posture relaxed and unbothered. It was like being in Iraq all over again, facing an enemy who thought they'd already won. Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, a faint smile on her lips. "This is your fault," she said when I demanded answers. "You left me. You made me lonely." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I left to give us a life," I said, "and you threw it away." She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to Tom and, with a smug laugh, slammed the door in my face. It was then I realized I wasn't just dealing with betrayal. I was dealing with two people who had built their happiness on the ruins of my sacrifice. The fire inside me had been ignited, but this was only the beginning. The man they had underestimated, the soldier they mocked, was about to teach them the meaning of loss. They say the truth will set you free, but no one ever tells you how much it will break you first. After Sarah slammed that door in my face, laughing with her lover like I was some pathetic joke, I stood there for what felt like hours. The cold night air bit at my skin, but the fire burning inside me kept me from feeling it. I knew then that I couldn't just walk away. I needed to know the full extent of what I was up against, what she had taken from me. The next morning, I started digging, not because I wanted to punish myself further, but because I needed clarity. How deep did this betrayal go? How long had I been living a lie? The answers came quickly, and they were far worse than I could have imagined. I started with the bank accounts. I had access to them all, but I hadn't checked in years. Why would I? Sarah was supposed to be managing our finances while I was deployed, using my salary to pay off the mortgage, save for retirement, and build the future we had planned together. At least, that's what I thought. The reality was a nightmare. Thousands of dollars gone. Withdrawals for cash I never authorized. Charges at luxury boutiques, high-end restaurants, and five-star hotels. There were even payments for a gym membership, but not for her. It was for him. Tom. His name was plastered all over the statements, a smug reminder of everything they had stolen from me. The most infuriating part? She hadn't even tried to hide it. The transactions were there in plain sight, as if she knew I wouldn't look. Or worse, as if she didn't care if I did. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. 7 years of sacrifice, of living in a war zone, of watching friends die while I clung to the hope of a better life back home. And for what? So they could live like royalty while I ate MREs and dodged bullets? After combing through the finances, I needed answers from someone who had seen what was happening while I was gone. The neighbors seemed like the logical choice. I started with Mr. Wilson, the retired teacher who lived across the street. He'd always been polite, always waved when I got home from deployments. "Michael," he said, his voice cautious when I knocked on his door. "It's good to see you back. How's life treating you?" I got straight to the point. "Mr. Wilson, I need to ask you something. Did you see anyone coming and going from my house while I was away?" His eyes widened slightly, and he looked over my shoulder, as if checking to see if Sarah was nearby. "Well, Michael, I don't like to gossip." I gave him a look that made it clear I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He sighed. "There was a man," he admitted. "He was around a lot. Sarah said he was an old friend helping with repairs, but," he trailed off, his discomfort palpable. "But what?" I pressed. He hesitated. "They didn't act like friends. Not the way I've seen friends act." I thanked him and moved on to the next house, then the next. The stories were all the same. They'd seen Tom's car in the driveway at all hours. They'd seen him and Sarah walking hand in hand down the street. One neighbor even mentioned seeing them kiss in public. The betrayal wasn't just private. It was a spectacle. That night, I went through the pile of unopened letters I'd found in her drawer. I read each one, my own words twisting the knife deeper. I'd written to her about everything. How much I missed her, how much I loved her, how I couldn't wait to come home and start our lives together. I told her about the horrors I'd seen, the friends I'd lost, the nightmares that kept me awake at night. I bared my soul on those pages, and she hadn't even opened them. It wasn't just neglect. It was cruelty. She hadn't cared enough to read my words, just as she hadn't cared enough to respect my sacrifices. She had already moved on, already replaced me with someone else. The next day, I decided to confront her. I waited until she came home, her laughter echoing through the hallway as she walked in with Tom. They didn't even notice me sitting there, waiting. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. She froze, her smile fading instantly. Tom, ever the smug bastard, stepped forward. "Michael," he said, his tone dripping with mock concern, "is everything all right?" I ignored him, my eyes locked on her. "I know everything," I said. "The money, the hotels, the car, him." Her expression shifted, not to guilt, but to defiance. "What did you expect, Michael?" she snapped. "You left me alone for 7 years. Did you think I'd just sit around waiting for you?" "I expected you to honor the life we built," I said through gritted teeth. "I expected you to respect the sacrifices I made." Tom laughed, and it took everything in me not to punch him right there. "Sacrifices?" he said. "Oh, come on. You signed up for that life. Nobody forced you to leave her behind." Sarah didn't even defend me. She just stood there, arms crossed, as if daring me to say more. "You're pathetic," I said, standing to leave. "Both of you." As I reached the door, she called after me, "You'll never get anything back, Michael. It's all mine now." She slammed the door again, the sound ringing in my ears. But this time, I didn't feel defeated. I felt something else, something sharper. I felt vengeance. You never forget the sound of a door slamming in your face. That sharp, final punctuation. The sound of someone telling you, without words, that you no longer matter. Sarah and Tom laughed as they shut me out, their voices muffled by the solid barrier between us, but the message was loud and clear. I was nothing to them. A joke. An afterthought. That moment didn't just shatter my heart. It ignited something darker inside me. Something that had been honed and sharpened during my years in Iraq. They thought they had one. They thought I would walk away quietly, tail between my legs, and let them enjoy the life they had stolen from me. But they didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. The first few days after that encounter were a blur of rage and humiliation. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything but their smug faces. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's cold defiance and Tom's mocking smirk. They had turned my sacrifices into a punchline, and I couldn't let that stand. I started small, gathering information. It was instinctual, like slipping back into the mindset of a soldier on a mission. You don't act without intelligence. You don't move until you know exactly what you're dealing with. I went through every piece of evidence I had, bank statements, emails, even the scraps of information my neighbors had provided. I built a timeline of their betrayal, mapping out every instance where they had crossed a line. And then I started watching them. Sarah and Tom thought they were untouchable, so they didn't bother hiding their movements. Every morning, Tom would leave in my car, dressed in clothes Sarah had likely bought with my money. Every afternoon, Sarah would lounge on the porch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. They were creatures of habit, predictable in their arrogance. And that predictability was their first mistake. At first, I tried to take the high road. I contacted a lawyer, explaining the situation and asking what my options were. Surely there had to be some way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But the system wasn't built for people like me. It was built for people like Sarah. Unfortunately, my lawyer said, his voice careful, the accounts were joint. Legally, she had the right to access those funds. So she can just take everything? I asked, my voice rising. She already has, he said bluntly. The only way to fight this is to prove fraud or malicious intent. And even then, it'll be a long, expensive battle. Expensive. The word hit me like a slap. How could I afford a legal battle when everything I had worked for was gone? Sarah had drained the accounts dry, leaving me with nothing but debts and despair. The legal system had failed me. And when the system fails you, sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands. Emily showed up on my doorstep a week after Sarah slammed the door in my face. She was Sarah's younger sister, someone I hadn't seen in years. The two of them had a complicated relationship, always close on the surface but constantly at odds beneath it. Emily had always been the black sheep, the one who couldn't live up to Sarah's carefully curated image of perfection. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice low, "and I'm not here to defend her." I didn't trust her immediately. After all, she was Sarah's sister. But something in her eyes told me she wasn't here to cause trouble. She was here to settle a score. "She's been like this her whole life," Emily continued, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Manipulating people, using them, and then throwing them away when she's done. I tried to warn you before you married her, but you wouldn't listen." "That's the past," I said, crossing my arms. "What do you want now?" "To help you," she said simply. "If anyone deserves to see Sarah pay for what she's done, it's you." Emily wasn't just offering emotional support. She had information. She knew about Sarah's hidden accounts, the shady deals she had made to cover her tracks, and even some dirt on Tom. "He's a con artist," she said, handing me a file filled with photos and documents. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this. He finds women like Sarah, drains them dry, and then moves on to the next target." My anger deepened as I flipped through the file. Tom wasn't just a parasite. He was a professional leech. And Sarah? She was too blinded by her own greed and ego to see that she was just another mark. With Emily's help, I started crafting a plan. It wasn't about quick, impulsive revenge. That would be too easy. No, I wanted something deeper. I wanted to dismantle the life they had built piece by piece, to make them feel the same helplessness and despair they had inflicted on me. Step 1 was information. I learned everything I could about their routines, their weaknesses, and their secrets. Step 2 was leverage. Emily and I gathered enough dirt to ruin them socially, legally, and financially. Step 3? Well, that part would come later. For now, I was content to let them live in blissful ignorance, unaware of the storm that was brewing just outside their door. They thought they had one. They thought I was broken. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was a soldier. And soldiers don't give up. Soldiers strategize. Soldiers fight. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. And I wasn't going to stop until every last piece of what they had taken from me was reduced to ashes. The days after Emily came into the picture were a whirlwind of planning and quiet determination. Revenge isn't a sudden act. It's a process. It takes patience, precision, and an unshakable will. That's what the military taught me, and now, it was time to apply those lessons in the battlefield of my own life. Emily became my unlikely ally, and I'll admit, I was skeptical of her at first. She was Sarah's sister, after all, and loyalty tends to run deep in families. But as we spent hours sifting through files, emails, and bank statements, I realized Emily wasn't here to protect Sarah. She was here to expose her. Maybe it was years of pent-up resentment. Maybe it was guilt for not warning me sooner. Either way, she was thorough, and she hated Sarah almost as much as I did. Together, we pieced together a puzzle that was far more elaborate than I had imagined. Sarah and Tom weren't just indulging in an affair. They were living an entire fantasy world funded by my sacrifices. Tom had no job, no income. He lived entirely off Sarah's generosity she pulled straight from my bank account. They had purchased vacations, expensive clothes, and even a second car, all while I was thousands of miles away, dodging bullets and missing the comforts of home. Emily brought receipts. Literally. Hotel bookings under fake names, transactions funneled through hidden accounts, and even photos of Sarah and Tom at events where she had claimed to be working late. It wasn't just betrayal, it was mockery. They hadn't even bothered to cover their tracks, assuming I'd never be around long enough to notice. What stung the most, though, was the sheer audacity of it. They had built a life on the ruins of my dreams, and they didn't care. No, it was worse than that. They enjoyed it. Every dollar they spent, every lie they told, every moment they flaunted their relationship in front of the neighbors was like a knife to my back. But now, I had a knife of my own. I spent my days gathering intelligence and my nights planning my moves. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't need to. The anger, the The sheer drive to make them pay was more energizing than any coffee. Emily had suggested going public with what we found, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Public humiliation would come, but not before I dismantled them piece by piece. The first step was subtle. I started leaving little reminders around the house, things Sarah couldn't ignore. An old photo of us from before my deployment, strategically placed on the kitchen counter. A pair of my dog tags on her dresser. Even a note I'd written her years ago, folded neatly and left on her pillow. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had thrown away. I wanted her to know I was watching, that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. It worked. I noticed the way her demeanor changed, how she avoided meeting my eyes whenever we crossed paths. Tom, on the other hand, was still smug, still confident in his position. That was fine. He wouldn't be for long. The next move was financial. Emily and I found a hidden account Sarah had opened under Tom's name. It was a small victory, but it gave me a foothold. With the help of a lawyer, I froze the account, cutting off a chunk of their funds. Sarah noticed almost immediately, her frustration spilling over during one of her heated phone calls with Tom. "I don't know what happened," she hissed, pacing the living room. "Just deal with it." I smiled from the next room, listening quietly. This was just the beginning. The neighbors started noticing things, too. Sarah had always been the queen bee of our little community, hosting parties and flaunting her perfect life. But as I began to pull the strings, her facade started to crack. The invitations stopped coming. The whispers grew louder. People were starting to see her for who she really was, and she couldn't stand it. One night, I overheard her arguing with Tom on the porch. "He's ruining everything," she snapped. "You said he wouldn't fight back." Tom, ever the arrogant fool, just laughed. Let him play his little games. "He's harmless." Harmless. That word stuck with me. It fueled me. They thought I was weak, that I didn't have the spine to stand up to them. They didn't know what I was capable of. Emily warned me not to go too far, and maybe she was right. But there's a point where reason and restraint stop matching. I had spent years sacrificing for Sarah, trusting her, believing in a life we were building together. She had taken all of that and turned it into a cruel joke. I wasn't about to let her get the last laugh. So, I planned. Quietly, carefully, relentlessly. Sarah and Tom were living on borrowed time, and they didn't even know it. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every insult they had thrown my way was about to come crashing down on them. They thought they had one. They had no idea the game had only just begun. The night I finally confronted Sarah and Tom felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The air was charged, every sound amplified, every movement deliberate. I didn't plan it, not entirely. The moment just came, as natural as pulling a trigger when the enemy is in your sights. They had underestimated me, and tonight, they would learn the price of their arrogance. I had been waiting for them in the living room. The house was dark except for the faint glow of a single lamp. I wanted them to walk into the tension, to feel the weight of my presence before I said a word. When the door creaked open, I heard their voices first, Sarah's high-pitched laughter, Tom's smug drawl. They didn't even bother whispering. "Relax, Sarah," Tom said, his voice dripping with confidence. "He's harmless. What's he going to do? Write you another letter?" Her laughter was sharp and cruel, cutting through the silence like a knife. "He's pathetic," she said. "Always has been. I don't even know why I married him." I gripped the edge of the chair, my knuckles white, forcing myself to stay seated. Let them finish. Let them dig their graves deeper. They stepped into the living room, and their laughter stopped abruptly when they saw me sitting there. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just watched them, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice tinged with surprise and just a hint of fear. "What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my tone calm but icy. My eyes locked on hers, then shifted to Tom, who stood there with his hands in his pockets, a smirk playing on his lips. "Nice to see you again," Tom said, his voice casual, as if we were old friends catching up over drinks. "You should have let us know you were waiting. We could have brought you something." I ignored him, turning my gaze back to Sarah. "I've been thinking," I said, "about us, about everything I sacrificed for you. For this life. She flinched but quickly masked it with a forced smile. Michael, don't do this. It's late, and we're tired. Tired? I repeated, standing slowly. My movements were deliberate, measured. You're tired. 7 years of my life, Sarah. 7 years of deployments, of missing holidays, of watching my friends die while I fought for a future with you. And you're tired? Her smile faltered, and she glanced at Tom for support. He stepped forward, his smirk widening. Look, buddy, I get it. You're upset. But you've got to understand, this was inevitable. You were never here. She needed someone who could actually be there for her. Be there for her? I said, my voice rising slightly. Is that what you call using my money? Driving my car? Living in my house? Tom shrugged. She chose me. Get over it. For a moment, I saw red. My hands clenched into fists, and I took a step toward him, but Sarah quickly stepped between us. Stop it, both of you, she snapped. This isn't helping. Helping? I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, I'm beyond help, Sarah. But you know what? So are you. She narrowed her eyes, her defiance returning. I don't owe you anything, Michael. You left me alone for years. What did you think was going to happen? That I'd just wait for you forever? I thought you'd keep your promises, I said, my voice low and steady. I thought you'd respect the life we built together. But I was wrong. You don't respect anything? Tom chuckled, shaking his head. This is pathetic. Honestly, Michael, you need to move on. Sarah and I. You and Sarah, I interrupted, stepping closer. My voice was calm, but my presence was anything but. You think this is a joke? You think you can walk into my life, take everything I worked for, and laugh in my face? Why not? Tom said, his smirk unwavering. What are you going to do about it? I stood there, staring him down, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then I smiled. A small, cold smile that sent a flicker of uncertainty across his face. You'll see, I said simply. For the first time, Tom looked uneasy. He glanced at Sarah, who was staring at me like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Good. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. I stepped back, picking up my jacket from the chair. Enjoy your night, I said, my voice calm and measured. You've earned it. They didn't respond, too stunned to speak. I walked past them, out the front door, and into the cool night air. The sound of the door closing behind me was sharp, final. But unlike the last time Sarah slammed a door in my face, this time, I didn't feel defeated. I felt in control. As I walked away, I could hear their voices faintly through the door. Tom was laughing again, though it sounded forced. Sarah was quieter, her tone uncertain. They thought they had won again, that they had chased me off. They had no idea what was coming. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't going to hold back. I waited until the house went quiet. The lights went out one by one, and I knew they were asleep, blissfully unaware of what was coming. Sarah and Tom probably thought they'd won, that I had finally given up, walked away, tail between my legs. They didn't know I wasn't built for surrender. 7 years of war zones had forged me into someone who could endure, someone who could strike when the moment was right. This moment had been planned meticulously. Revenge isn't just about rage. It's about calculation. It's about taking everything your enemy holds dear and watching it crumble, knowing they have no one to blame but themselves. Sarah and Tom didn't just steal my money or my house. They stole my dignity, my trust, my belief in the life I thought I was building. Tonight, I was taking it all back. I parked a few streets away, out of sight, and walked toward the house under the cover of darkness. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of quiet that only comes in the dead of night. I moved with purpose, every step measured, every sound carefully muffled. The tools I needed were in my bag: gloves, a wrench, a lighter, and a small container of accelerant. Simple things, unassuming, but deadly in the right hands. When I reached the house, I stood outside for a moment, staring at it. The house I had bought, the one I had imagined coming home to after each deployment, the house I had poured my sweat and soul into, only to have it turned into a den of betrayal. My chest tightened, but not with regret. There was no room for that anymore. Only resolve. The gas line was easy to find. I had scoped it out days ago, tracing its path from the street to the house. With precision honed through years of military training, I worked quickly, loosening the connection just enough to allow the gas to escape. The faint hiss of it escaping into the night was almost comforting, a promise of what was to come. I moved to the side of the house, pouring the accelerant along the base of the walls. I knew exactly where to place it to ensure the fire would spread rapidly. The garage, the porch, the window frames, they all received careful attention. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about efficiency. When I was done, I stood back, surveying my work. This was it, the moment of no return. I struck the lighter, the tiny flame flickering in the darkness. For a brief second, I thought of Sarah's smile on our wedding day, of the promises we had made. But then I remembered the laughter, the mocking way she had dismissed me, the way she had slammed the door in my face. I tossed the flame onto the accelerant, and it roared to life, racing along the lines I had drawn. The fire grew quickly, licking up the walls and spreading with a ferocity that mirrored the rage inside me. The windows shattered from the heat, and smoke began to pour into the night. I stepped back, retreating to a vantage point where I could watch without being seen. The house that had once been my dream was now an inferno, a monument to betrayal and retribution. It didn't take long for the screams to start. "Michael!" Sarah's voice cut through the crackle of the flames, high-pitched and panicked. "Michael, help!" Tom's voice followed, louder but just as desperate. "Help us, please!" They were trapped. I had made sure of that. The fire spread too quickly, blocking their exits, leaving them nowhere to go. Their screams grew louder, their cries for mercy more frantic. "Michael, please. We're sorry. Help us." I stood there, watching, listening. Their pleas echoed in the night, but they didn't reach me. Not really. Whatever part of me had once loved Sarah, once cared about her, was gone, burned away long before the flames reached her. All that was left was a cold, quiet resolve. The fire department arrived eventually, their sirens piercing the night. Neighbors began to gather, their faces illuminated by the glow of the flames. Some whispered, others shouted, but I didn't hear them. My focus was on the house, on the way it collapsed in on itself, the roof caving in, the walls crumbling. Everything Sarah and Tom had built on the ruins of my sacrifice was now ashes. I walked away before the fire was fully extinguished, blending into the shadows. My work was done. I didn't feel triumph, not exactly. Revenge isn't satisfying the way people think it is. It doesn't heal the wounds or erase the pain, but it does bring closure. And in that moment, watching the house burn, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Sarah and Tom had screamed my name for mercy, but mercy wasn't mine to give. They had made their choices, and tonight, they paid for them. The fire reduced everything to ashes. By the time the fire department arrived, there wasn't much left to save. Neighbors huddled together, some in tears, others whispering in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. Sarah and Tom's bodies had been pulled from the wreckage hours earlier, charred and unrecognizable, their screams now silenced forever. I stayed at a distance, just another face in the crowd. Nobody suspected me. Why would they? I was the grieving husband, the war hero who had come home to a life shattered by tragedy. I kept my face neutral, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, watching the firefighters douse the last embers of the life Sarah and Tom had built together. The official report came quickly, faulty gas lines. A tragic accident. The investigators pieced together a narrative that absolved everyone of blame, except fate, of course. The old pipes in the house, the renovations Sarah had insisted on, and the presence of accelerants were explained away as unfortunate coincidences. It was almost too perfect. I had made sure of that. The neighborhood mourned Sarah and Tom as if they were martyrs. They brought flowers to the charred remains of the house, muttering words of pity and loss. Such a tragedy, they said. They were such a beautiful couple. The irony wasn't lost on me. None of them knew the truth about who Sarah and Tom really were. The lies they told, the lives they ruined. None of them knew what they'd taken from me. And now, they never would. Mark wasn't convinced. He showed up at my door a few days after the fire, his expression a mixture of sadness and something sharper. Doubt, maybe. Mark had known me for years, served with me overseas. He knew the kind of man I was, or at least the kind of man I used to be. "Michael," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You okay?" I shrugged. "As okay as I can be." He studied me carefully, his eyes narrowing. "It's just weird, isn't it? The fire. The timing. You coming back right before it happened." I held his gaze, my expression carefully neutral. "What are you saying, Mark?" "I'm not saying anything," he said quickly. "But you've got to admit, it's a hell of a coincidence." "Life's full of coincidences," I replied, my tone flat. He didn't look away, didn't back down. "You didn't do anything, did you? You'd tell me if you did, right?" For a moment, I let the silence hang between us. Then I gave him the faintest of smiles. "Mark, if I'd done something, do you think I'd tell you?" His jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. "You're not denying it." "I'm not confirming it either," I said. "And unless you've got proof, I'd suggest you drop it." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Michael. I don't know what to think." "You don't have to think anything," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Let it go, Mark. What's done is done." He stared at me for a long time, his face conflicted. Then he nodded slowly and stood. "You're lucky I'm your friend." "No," I said quietly. "You're lucky I'm yours." Mark left without another word, but I could feel his suspicion lingering like a shadow. He wouldn't push further. I knew him well enough to be sure of that, but I also knew he'd never look at me the same way again. Emily was a different story. She showed up the day after the fire, her expression unreadable as she sat across from me at the kitchen table. For a long time, she didn't speak, just stared at her coffee as if it held the answers to the questions she couldn't ask. "You did it, didn't you?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "I'm not going to say anything," she said. "They deserved it. Both of them." I nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between us. Emily didn't ask for details, didn't press for explanations. She just sipped her coffee and stared out the window, her silence more powerful than any words. "They're calling it an accident," she said after a while. "Faulty gas lines. Nobody suspects a thing." "Good," I said simply. She set her mug down and stood. "I should go." As she reached the door, she turned back to me. "Michael, was it worth it?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I met her gaze and said, "They screamed my name for mercy. That's all I needed to hear." Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute, and walked out without another word. The house was gone. Sarah and Tom were gone. The world had moved on, and so had I. But their screams? Their screams would stay with me forever. A reminder of what betrayal costs. A reminder of what I was capable of. And in the quiet moments, when the world grew still, I would let myself feel it. Not regret, but something close. The weight of justice, heavy and cold. The first few days after the fire, I told myself it was over. Sarah and Tom were gone, their lives reduced to ashes along with everything they'd stolen from me. I had executed my plan flawlessly. No one suspected me, not even the investigators who combed through the wreckage. The fire was ruled a tragic accident, and the community mourned them as victims rather than the schemers and betrayers they truly were. But in the quiet moments, when the world slowed down and the weight of silence pressed on me, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly won? The thing about revenge is that it doesn't feel the way you think it will. It's not cathartic, not a sweeping wave of satisfaction that wipes away all the pain. No, it lingers, sharp and heavy, like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. I had thought their screams would be enough to silence the rage inside me, but instead, they echoed in my mind, haunting and relentless. I thought about Sarah often, but not in the way I used to. I didn't remember the woman I fell in love with, the one who had stood by me at the altar, promising a life built on love and loyalty. No, I remembered the woman who had laughed in my face, who had spent years using me as a bank account while building a life with another man. That was the Sarah I avenged, the Sarah I erased. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the version of her I'd wanted to believe in. The one who read my letters and cried when she missed me. The one who dreamed of the same future I did. That Sarah, I realized, had never existed. She was a figment of my imagination, a projection of my hope. And letting go of her was harder than letting go of the real Sarah. Then there was Tom. I didn't think about him much. He didn't deserve the space in my mind. But when I did, it was with a cold, detached curiosity. What kind of man could so easily leech off another's sacrifice, so shamelessly mock the life I'd built? His death didn't haunt me. It reassured me. The world was better off without him. It wasn't just me who bore the weight of their betrayal. The ripple effect spread further than I had imagined. Neighbors who had once idolized Sarah now whispered about her lavish lifestyle, questioning how she had afforded it all. Friends who had supported her during my deployments looked at the wreckage of her life and felt the sting of their misplaced trust. Emily, too, carried her own burden. She had helped me, yes, but that didn't mean she was untouched by the aftermath. She confided in me one night, her voice barely audible over the hum of her coffee maker. "I hated her for what she did to you," she said, staring into her mug. "But she was still my sister. And now, she's gone." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Emily had been my ally, my accomplice in some ways, but she had also lost someone. It wasn't the same as my loss. Hers was tinged with regret and lingering familial love, but it was a loss nonetheless. Mark, on the other hand, was a constant presence, though I could tell he was still grappling with his suspicions. He never outright accused me, but his questions lingered in our conversations like shadows. "How are you holding up?" he'd ask, his tone probing, as if he were searching for cracks in my armor. "I'm fine," I'd reply, deflecting with practiced ease. "Just taking it one day at a time." "You know," he said one night over beers, "if you ever did something drastic, I'd understand. Betrayal does things to a man." I met his gaze, my expression unreadable. "Thanks, Mark, but I'm just trying to move forward." He nodded, but his eyes told me he didn't believe me. Maybe he didn't need to. Mark was a soldier, too. He knew what it meant to carry out a mission and live with the consequences. Moving forward wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible. Emily became a surprising source of comfort. We spent more time together, her sharp wit and unfiltered honesty a balm to the wounds Sarah had left. She didn't pity me. She understood me. There was a strength in her, a resilience born from years of living in Sarah's shadow, and it drew me to her. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me and said, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "Everything," she said. "The fire, them, all of it." I took a long breath, letting the weight of her question settle over me. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not for the reasons you think. I don't regret what I did. I regret that it had to happen." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever forgive yourself?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think I can live with it." Emily reached over and placed her hand on mine, a silent gesture of understanding. We didn't speak after that, but we didn't need to. The past was behind us. The fire burned out. All that remained was the faint glow of a new beginning. And as I sat there, watching the stars emerge one by one, I realized something. Revenge hadn't healed me, but it had given me clarity. It stripped away the illusions, leaving only the truth. That I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of rebuilding. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In the days following the fire, I thought I had all the answers. Sarah and Tom were parasites, feeding off my sacrifice and spitting in my face when I returned. My revenge had been the final chapter of their story, or so I believed. But life has a way of revealing twists when you least expect them, and as the investigation dragged on, new truths came to light. Truths that made me question everything I thought I knew. The first hint came from the lead investigator, a middle-aged man named Daniels. He stopped by my house one morning, clipboard in hand and a furrow in his brow. "We've been digging through the rubble," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Found some interesting things." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Like what?" Well, he said, flipping through his notes, we found a safe in the master bedroom. It was heavily damaged, but we managed to salvage some of its contents. Mostly documents. Documents? I asked, my stomach tightening. Daniels gave me a long look before continuing. Bank statements, contracts, things like that. But one file stood out, a series of emails between Sarah and Tom. I forced myself to remain calm. What did they say? Daniels hesitated, as if gauging how much to share. It looks like Sarah was blackmailing Tom. She had evidence of some questionable activities on his part. Fraud, identity theft, things like that. She was threatening to expose him unless he stayed with her. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was blackmailing him? I repeated, struggling to process the revelation. Daniels nodded. It seems their relationship wasn't as one-sided as it looked. They were using each other, plain and simple. Toxic doesn't even begin to describe it. I thanked him for the update and watched as he drove away, my mind spinning. Blackmail? Fraud? Sarah had always been manipulative, but this was on another level. I had thought Tom was the puppet master, pulling her strings, but it seemed they had been locked in a twisted dance of mutual exploitation. The life they had built wasn't just stolen from me. It was poisoned from the inside. Mark, of course, had his own thoughts on the matter. He showed up that evening, 2 beers in hand, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. You hear about the blackmail? He asked, cracking open a can. Yeah, I said, taking a sip of my own. Changes things, doesn't it? Not really, Mark replied, leaning back in his chair. They were both pieces of crap. Doesn't matter who was pulling the strings. They deserved each other. I studied him carefully. Mark wasn't one to mince words, but there was something deeper in his tone, a hint of unease. You don't look convinced, I said. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Michael, I'm not stupid. The fire, the timing, everything. It doesn't add up. I know you're involved. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I took another sip of my beer, letting the silence hang between us. If you think that, I said finally, why haven't you said anything to Daniels? Mark met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Because I don't want to. And I don't need to. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and some truths are better left buried. For a moment, we just stared at each other, 2 soldiers who had seen too much and understood even more. Finally, Mark stood, clapping me on the shoulder. Whatever happened, it's done. Let it stay that way. He left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Mark's decision to protect me didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like solidarity. He knew the cost of betrayal, the weight of vengeance, and he wasn't going to make me carry it alone. Emily, meanwhile, had been busy unraveling Sarah's hidden assets. With the investigators focused on the fire, she had quietly gone through Sarah's remaining accounts and uncovered a treasure trove of secrets. There were offshore accounts, investments under false names, and even a piece of land Sarah had purchased in secret. She was planning her escape, Emily said, handing me a folder filled with documents. If things went south with Tom, she wanted a way out. Typical, I muttered, flipping through the pages. She was always looking out for herself. Emily smirked. Well, now it's ours. What do you mean? I asked, looking up at her. Legally, I'm her next of kin, Emily said. And since she didn't leave a will, everything she owned defaults to me. I want you to have half. I blinked, stunned. Emily, I can't. Don't argue, she interrupted, her tone firm. You deserve it more than anyone. Consider it compensation for everything she took from you. I hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. With Emily's help, I began rebuilding. The money wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. I bought a modest house in a quieter part of town, far from the ashes of my old life. Emily stayed close, her presence a reminder that not all connections were built on lies. The twists in Sarah and Tom's story didn't absolve them, but they added complexity to their downfall. They weren't just villains. They were victims of their own greed and selfishness. And while their deaths didn't bring me peace, they brought me closure. As I sat on the porch of my new home, the sun setting on another day, I realized that justice isn't always clean. Sometimes, It's messy, complicated, and hard to define. But it's justice all the same. Life after the fire was quiet, almost too quiet. The silence wasn't oppressive, though. It was reflective, like the calm after a storm when the world feels both broken and brand new. I'd achieved what I set out to do, but there was no victory lap, no triumphant ending. Just the slow, steady task of rebuilding. Therapy was Emily's idea. At first, I resisted. Talking to a stranger about the darkest parts of my life felt pointless. What could they say that would make any of this easier? But Emily had a way of pushing just hard enough without breaking me. "You've carried enough, Michael," she'd said one night. "Maybe it's time to let someone help." Reluctantly, I went. The first few sessions were awkward, filled with long silences and vague answers. But gradually, the therapist chipped away at my walls. We talked about the betrayal, the rage, and, eventually, the fire. Not in detail, never in detail, but enough to make me confront what I'd done. It wasn't about guilt or justification. It was about understanding. And understanding, as I learned, was the first step toward peace. Emily became my anchor in those days. She was always there, whether it was a quick phone call to check in or a quiet evening on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Our bond grew stronger, forged in the shared loss of Sarah and the complicated relief of her absence. "Do you ever think about starting over?" she asked me one evening, her voice soft but curious. "Starting over how?" I asked, though I already knew what she meant. She smiled faintly. "With someone who understands you. Someone who sees you for who you are." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at her, really looked at her. Emily had been my ally, my confidant, and now, maybe, something more. There was no rush to define it, no need to force a label. For now, her presence was enough. The community moved on quickly, as communities often do. The fire became just another story, a tragedy that people whispered about for a while before filing it away in the back of their minds. They mourned Sarah and Tom, painted them as victims, and never questioned the narrative the investigators provided. And that was fine. Let them believe what they wanted. The truth wasn't theirs to carry, it was mine. Sometimes, I catch myself staring at the horizon, lost in thought. The weight of what I did will always be there, a shadow I can't outrun. But I've learned to live with it, to accept that justice isn't always clean or easy. It's messy, painful, and, at times, haunting. But it's mine, and that's enough.